So we also want to find a way to compare the economic growth rates and living standards in between countries as well as over time. And that's what this video is about. And so if we want to compare economic growth rates and living standards, then we have to understand that not everything is being reported. Every country has a shadow economy, and this is the output of goods and services hidden from the authorities. And there are good reasons for why people would want them hidden. So this includes anything illegal like drugs, as well as tax evasion. And we can prove that this economy exists because when we measure GDP, remember there are three ways to measure GDP, right? There's the expenditure approach, income approach, the value added approach. When we measure GDP with each approach, we end up with a different number. And so because that's what happens, we can only prove that something else is happening, and we don't know what that is. Now, the shadow economy understates changes in GDP, and as a result, GNI and NNI. And the size of the shadow economy is influenced by things like rates of taxation. So the higher the tax rate, the more incentive companies and people have for tax evasion. We also look at the punishment for illegal activity. If illegal activity doesn't really result in a harsh punishment, then people have an incentive to engage in it. And also the risk of being caught. Like if there isn't a high quality, powerful policing force and people aren't being caught for their crimes, then there's going to be a lot more people engaging in transactions in the shadow economy. And so the last thing is social attitudes towards these said activities. If it's more accepted by society, chances are more people will do that thing. Now, there are 4 reasons why GDP as a measure of living standards is insufficient. And this is kind of going into the evaluation of indicators. And this applies to GNI and NNI as well. Low literacy rates complicate information gathering and information accuracy. And so a lot of things just might not be reported. And so people might not be reporting their income. That's one thing. Now, thing number 2 is non-market goods go unrecorded. And so any domestic work, any volunteer work, cash transactions would also go unrecorded in the GDP. Number 3, government spending might be difficult to measure. There's a lot of bureaucracy that might prevent the relevant bodies from getting the information. And some projects might just be too secretive and nobody even knows about it. And so as a result, we can't attain accurate information. And then number 4, the sustainability of growth also needs to be considered. So sometimes if GDP is increasing rapidly and it's really high, we have to ask the question of, are we depleting our non-renewable resources to get this result? And if we are, then maybe that information will paint a different picture. There are 5 reasons why real GDP may misrepresent living standards over time. And so now we're concerned with real GDP. Now, real GDP usually is a measure of living standards, but it might be inaccurate in times of war because an economy will produce a lot more military goods, and military goods do not increase living standards. So GDP might be high, but living standards might be low. Number 2, producing capital goods also won't have an immediate increase on living standards. And so this is things like building lots of factories, building lots of machinery. Military goods are also a part of all of that as well. Number 3, happiness and consumption don't have a clear relationship. Just because real GDP is high doesn't mean people are happy. And if people aren't happy, living standards are low. And so one example is lifestyle inflation or lifestyle creep, right? So the more money we make, the more money we tend to spend. And so as a result, we always feel like we don't have enough money. And so as a result, we're always not that happy. So that's just one example. Number 4, increases in real GDP might just be due to quantity and not quality of goods and services. So GDP might have just gone up because we made more stuff and the quality didn't increase. So technically, people aren't that much better off because there's only so many televisions I can own. There's only so many cars I can drive. Number 5, changes in working standards and hours, leisure, environment, freedoms, inequality, they're all not reported in the GDP. And so we have to account for all of those things if we want an accurate picture of the level of living standard in a country. And so if we want to compare GDP and living standards between countries, we use purchasing power parity. I talked about this in a video beforehand. And this is just a method used to compare how much money is needed in different countries to buy the same items. And it helps compare living standards between countries more accurately than just looking at how much money people are making. And so let's go through an example. How does it work? Well, I want you to imagine a shopping basket filled with different goods and services that people commonly buy. Like the average family, that's what they buy. PPP calculates how much this basket costs in different countries using their currencies. And so we look at GDP with purchasing power parity. So we use PPP to figure out how many of these baskets a country's average income or GDP per capita can buy. This shows us the real value of money in each country, right? We're concerned with purchasing power and helps us compare the standard of living. And so let's go through an example with US and Malaysia using hypothetical numbers. So let's say the average American makes $50,000 a year, and the average Malaysian makes 12,000 ringgits a year. So the cost of our basket is 24 ringgits in Malaysia, so for a basket of goods and services. For the same basket of the same goods and services, the cost is $200 in the USA. So who has a higher standard of living? Well, with $50,000, Americans can buy 250 baskets. 50,000 divided by $200 per basket. With 12,000 ringgits, Malaysians can buy 5 baskets. 12,000 ringgits divided by 2,400 ringgits per basket. So even after adjusting for the cost of living, Americans can buy more baskets. This implies that the average American has a higher standard of living than the average Malaysian. But by how much? Well, Americans can buy 250 baskets while the Malaysians can buy 5 baskets. To compare, we can see that Americans can buy 50 times more baskets than Malaysians because 250 divided by 5 is 50. And so on average, we can say Americans are 50 times more well off or better off in terms of living standards compared to the average Malaysian. Now, obviously, this method of comparing living standards between countries is filled with factors that we're not accounting for, factors that I mentioned in the previous slide. And so when you're evaluating a method like GDP or GNI, NNI, you have to keep that in mind.